And it is in this way that Sri Aurobindo describes the mother. The mother whom we knew in this physical body and form, whom we know in this physical body and form, he said, is at the same time holding the status of the Divine Mother as an individual mother, as the universal Divine Mother, and the transcendent Divine Mother, and all three simultaneously in alignment. And there is one special photo which resonates with a particular aspect of our Ishta Devata. When you see her standing or seated before the map of India, which she drew in the playground, you must know the significance of that. When India became free of colonial rule, it was unfortunately a freedom which was divided. Sri Aurobindo made a special attempt to prevent that division by sending, first of all, by initiating the Cripps mission by a spiritual occult intervention, and then sending a special emissary from the ashram to the political heads at the time, pleading with them to accept the Cripps proposal because it was the last chance given to have freedom without partition. And knowing full well that if this was missed, there would be partition. And this message was actually conveyed to the people who decided to have partition eventually. And of course it was rebuffed very rudely by Mahatma Gandhi. And when the emissary came back to Sri Aurobindo and said this was the message, he was equal, he did not comment. But then he was asked by the emissary, if you knew that it was going to fail, why did you send me? And Sri Aurobindo said it was necessary in the larger balance of things. The effort itself initiated sets certain wheels of energy moving, so to say, which have their consequences. The mother subsequently worked for the reunification of India, intervening even politically, advising the prime ministers who were open to her, particularly with Indira Gandhi, in whom she found an effective instrument, and she guided her in detail during the Bangladesh war, sending messages regularly. The person on the military side who was involved in the signals, communications, was a devotee, and he would convey messages to the mother and take her messages back to the generals. Many of those generals experienced such an extraordinary help spiritually that subsequent to the war, they came and met the mother. Several of them chose to settle in Auroville subsequently, and one more who became later, he was awarded Field Marshal, bequeathed his entire estate to the mother after his passing. Such was the impact of that contact. In the last discussion on this topic, which is recorded in the mother's agenda, Satprem asks her about what's happening with the war, and she says that a huge mistake was made when Indira Gandhi did not complete the work that had to be done to take over West Pakistan. After Bangladesh was liberated, Mother had instructed her to immediately go and take over West Pakistan. It did not happen. There was pressure from America then and military pressure. So Indira Gandhi caved in. The result was, of course, terrible. At that time it was not known, but Mother said that this was a grave mistake. India would suffer greatly, and there would be a lot of fight and even possibility of war. And then after a few weeks, when again Satprem asks her about it, she says, oh, all that is taken care of. So, meaning she has already intervened. And then she says, in what form? She says that it was, she says the words, I think it was shown to her, but obviously it's work that she did for the outcome. She says it will not be through war anymore, and the world situation will change. America will support India instead of Pakistan, and at that point Pakistan will begin to break up internally into 5 parts, and one by one each of those parts will want to rejoin with India. I'm giving these details because all of this has to be seen in the context of that map of the united India and the work that they put, the enormous work that they put to bring back that unity. So in 1947, when the partition took place, it was a terrible period. Historically, it has not been sufficiently highlighted. In human history, there has not been a greater migration and a greater suffering as a result of migration as took place at that point. Millions of people died, and literally a body was torn apart across. And it was a very difficult period. At that time, Mother took a marker and in a state of intense concentration, in trance-like state, she drew the united map of India in the playground. Now you see the significance of this. She did not put it in the meditation hall where people will sit for meditation. She put it in the playground. Where people exercise with their physical energies and develop their vitality. There, she sat herself, took classes. She stood. In those days, there would be a march past every day. She stood there, taking the salute. Of all the students and the sadhaks who were part of the physical program, in herself embodying the individual mother that we know, the personality that we related to as children, Mother India, Universal Mother and Transcendent Divine Mother, all 4 at the same time. It has such a powerful occult and spiritual import for India and for humanity. It is at the same time affirming and fixing the role that India has to play in the future of humanity and in human evolution, but at the same time invoking and imprinting consciousness in that aspect of the Divine Mother that we know as Mother India, imprinting that highest transcendent power and consciousness, not only for healing, but for awakening and for the future work which has to be done. And this with the children who march past, who exercise in front of her. The classes she took for their intellectual and spiritual training, all of that taking place right there in front of that map. There is the famous photograph where you see the mother seated with 4 politicians, Jawaharlal Nehru, then Kamraj, then the third, who? Shastri, Lal Bahadur Shastri, Kamraj, and then Indira Gandhi. And it's not a coincidence, all of them became Prime Minister practically. Kamraj was practically Prime Minister, but he played that role, and Indira Gandhi eventually. But in that sequence, literally, they're seated in that sequence they take power subsequently. And it's not a coincidence. And because the mother put all that power that she brought down for this development. Now, because we have that photo, we can see that this is what she did. If we don't have a photograph, we would not even know. There would be no physical record of it. But the work would still be done. To the extent that they were able to open to her, she was able to act on them. I heard from Udarda the narration of what he saw when the mother met Indira Gandhi. He said, she went in like a lamb and she came out like a tigress. And afterwards, mother commented that she brought down the highest power and Indira Gandhi was able to absorb all of it. Now after that she went back. She was at that time just a young girl who had got into politics by inheritance. Nobody gave her much importance. But with that power which the mother had imprinted in her, she went back and the whole of politics took a different turn. She split the Congress, called the new Congress, Congress I for Indira, but equally you can say I, her own individual ego. The other Congress, which had all the powerful people, they literally faded out. You do not hear of them anymore. And suddenly this woman takes over, and there's a period of a very challenging passage of India, which according to the CIA report of that time, 1970s, it was I think 1972 or 73, that the CIA did an internal report which they titled The Dangerous Years, in which they declared that within 5 years India would break apart into many different states. And really that possibility existed, at least in the way politics normally functions. But it was during that time that Indira Gandhi had power, and sometimes with the abuse of power also equally. But something happened which held the whole country together in a way that nobody could have predicted in conventional politics. And after that the whole thing took a very different turn. I'm pointing to all this because here is one particular symbol, one particular representation of what the mother held in herself, aligning all these different levels of her consciousness simultaneously and imprinting on those who came before her that power. And you can see how initially we would approach her, and as we did as little children, through that Ishta Devata. Oh, the mother who looks after me when I fall ill, when I fall and scratch my foot, she puts a bandage, caresses me, gives me groundnuts, and smiles at me and makes me feel good. There's still children who grew up on that period. You approach them and you ask them, what was it like to be with the mother? Oh, she was like any mother. She fed us, she looked after us, she loved us, that's it. So it begins there, but you could stop there. If you didn't make the effort, you could go to the second level and see that behind this is this universal. There is the transcendent Divine Mother, and the real person, all personality, the infinite qualities, all of these are there at the same time, which also we may occasionally glimpse, get overwhelmed by, and then it fades and we meet somebody who is much more accessible. And so all these at the same time are present through this individualized personality aspect, even as at the same time there is this immense impersonal aspect which is behind. In our interaction with the mother, she would bring forward one or more of these as necessary with each person, including, and she has brought forward that impersonal, massive impersonal aspect also, as well as the various deities and powers of the Divine Mother, as you know, the 4 aspects and so on, and other aspects. On certain occasions, even embodying something of the supramental Mahashakti in herself to the degree that was possible for the earth to hold. And it is in this way that we have to see her. But this also gives us an understanding of what it is like when the self re-embraces its universe and the individual form and personality of this incarnation So he says, when in that we live and have our being, we can possess it in both its modes, the impersonal in a supreme state of being and consciousness, in an infinite impersonality of self-possessing power and being, the personal by the divine nature acting through the individual soul form, and by the relation between that and its transcendent and universal self. So here in the personal, there is this focus on the soul form, and through that, the relation with the transcendent and universal self. The difference between us and that is that the divine pours equally through all of them, through all centers of being. We, although now united with self, now operate through this special focus of the individualized personality. And occasionally we have the intermediate manifestation which we call the avatar, where that one whole divine personality still takes a human body and a human form and bridges these two. So continuing with the text, he says, we may keep even our relation with the personal deity in his forms and names. If, for instance, our work is predominantly a work of love, capital L, it is as the Lord of love that we can seek to serve and express him. But we shall have at the same time an integral realization of him in all his forms, in all his names and forms and qualities, and not mistake the front of him which is prominent in our attitude to the world for all the infinite Godhead. So that front is prominent in our attitude to the world, but we shall not make the mistake of limiting to that which is the all infinite Godhead. So he gives a good example. Depending on the work that you're meant to manifest, you may still relate to the Lord as that, through that aspect. So each one of us has some facet, some aspect which is more dominant in the overall line of development, at least of this life. Sometimes even across lives, but then across lives it's not so obvious unless you look at the big picture, because in each life there may be a slightly different emphasis, building the full spectrum, the full scope of the larger facet. But whatever it is that the soul is meant to grow through, and especially in this particular life, we may still retain that as the relationship with the personal deity in his forms and names, but not losing sight of the whole. And so when we turn to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, it is in this way that we can know them more deeply and more completely. There are some cryptic observations in Sri Aurobindo's diary notes where he refers to something, if I remember right, he writes, the part of me that is Shiva. It's very interesting, very suggestive. In the fullness of his consciousness, which is already has realized its oneness with the divine, the part of me that is Shiva. And he experiences with himself all of these statuses of the various forms of Godhead, even as the Mother manifested the power of each of these aspects and powers through her, being of course much more rich and diverse in their pouring out. And so we can not limit ourselves to these physical forms through whom we have known them. They may remain as Ishtadevata, but know through them the One and His Shakti, who presides over the whole manifestation of the cosmos, of whom we are a tiny part, a wave, a bubble, a ray, a child. So with this, we complete the chapter titled The Modes of the Self. And in the next chapter, he takes this to a deeper level of an experiential character, which is the realization of Satchidananda. What is it like to be living in that consciousness of the self, having healed all these different modes and what appeared to the human consciousness as extreme poles of the self, they are now seen as merely facets of one. What is the experience of that being living such? So the realization of the Satchidananda is the next chapter. We can pause here with any questions. It's an interesting comment. For those of us who are more inclined to seeing in form images, others may not see in form but feel in presence. It's interesting how the Divine Mother can reveal herself through any form, in any situation, in any circumstance, most unexpectedly, often as if guiding, navigating through the complexities of life. Or it may be emerging from within you briefly, as if a finger or a ray of light shows this, not that, and leading in this way. But because she is present in all things equally, it's very easy to manifest spontaneously. To complete the discussion about the map that the mother drew, when on one occasion India was attacked by Pakistan, and there was grave danger because the Indian army had not been prepared at all. Jawaharlal Nehru had even declared initially, at the time of independence, that India doesn't need an army because we have no enemies. And somebody asked, well, what if we are attacked? He said, well, China will protect us. It goes even more serious. At that time, the United Nations had just been formed, the Security Council had been created, and India was offered a place in the Security Council. And Nehru gave up that place, saying, we don't need it, give India's place to China. And you know how crazy that has been. China has blocked India's interests at every step. But anyway, such was the immaturity of our good-willed politicians then. And immediately after, there was the first invasion from Pakistan in Kashmir and all the rest which followed. But subsequently, several other attacks took place. But because Nehru did not want a strong army, he had kept the Prime Minister in the center. So if the army had to communicate with the Air Force, they had to go through the Prime Minister, who knew nothing about how they worked. So it was designed to split the forces and to weaken them. And the forces had been emasculated. They had not been given the necessary resources even to develop. So we had good people but no equipment. So when the Pakistani army actually sent in the most advanced tanks, you had people stand on the ground fighting tanks. And the extra stories at that point, of course the mother intervened. These people went to the, jumped onto them, dropped a grenade inside, then opened, got in and took over the tanks and turned it against the enemy. It was amazing. This kind of thing you do not find happening in normal people, in normal situations. And strangely enough, there were rains which bogged down the enemy tanks. All kinds of things happened. But at that time, when it had happened, it was a very serious danger because India was inequipped. And mother said, she looked at the map of India in the playground. And she saw one side was Durga's lion, the other side was Lakshmi's elephant. And she said, when Durga's lion and Lakshmi's elephant are protecting India, who can defeat India? Very interesting statement. But if you look at the map, you see this open mouth of the lion. Physically, the shape has that. But that's with the united map, where Pakistan is part of India. Equally, the head of the elephant, with the trunk going all the way down, is part of united India when Burma and all these places are part of the whole. And so, the protection is there only in the unity. As long as there is division, Sri Aurobindo actually wrote in his message on independence that because as long as there is division, there is serious danger of war and even of India being overtaken. But that must not and will not happen. And so he puts this strong affirming force. So we've lived in a very interesting period where you had in physical body all of these powers and levels of consciousness all aligned in a single being. And to see that and even to experience the way she worked is an extraordinary experience. But by the way, that situation has been changed. I think about 10 years ago, an integrated armed forces was created and politicians were removed from that loop. Politically, you mean? Why the division? Then spiritually. Well, there are many ways of looking at it. When you look at from above at why this division took place, it's not that it had to take place. It could have been avoided. And those are the efforts that Sri Aurobindo actually made. It took place because of human stupidity refusing the help given. So to that extent you can say it was inevitable, because human beings chose lines of action which made it inevitable. Okay? So Sri Aurobindo has a very interesting observation. There are people who say that all that happens for the best. But Sri Aurobindo says that's not true. All that happens does not happen for the best, but having happened, the divine makes the best use of it. That makes sense, you see. Things happen in spite of or because of foolishness of people, but the divine makes the best use of it. And so, the way we should look at it, the division and the chaos which followed need not have happened, should not have happened, but human stupidity ensured its happening. Having happened, the divine will make the best use of it to make for a stronger, more deeply integrated unity than might have emerged in a slow process otherwise. That's about all we can say. But it also involves delay. But the delay is really of human nature or human beings growing up enough to now be able to accept conditions where once again the unity can return. And it will. The divine will is only on that level. That unity has to emerge. Human nature in between and human conscious will can delay but not prevent. That's all. And that's what Mother worked for and foresaw, how that unification will take place. And all the signs, I'm mentioning this now because all the signs are there today in the changed world situation and what's happening internally in the dynamics of these countries. When you look back at the foresight of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, we are now at that time, 2017, where Sri Aurobindo was writing these articles in the Arya, describing the human cycle and the ideal of human unity, the social and political development and unification of the world, describing in minute detail all the problems which that unity will have to overcome, and the various means by which they can be overcome and the means by which they will not be overcome. And there, 100 years ago now, literal to the day, Sri Aurobindo wrote of the unity of Europe in a kind of a United States of Europe, which is really the concept of the European Union. But it describes there what are the internal tendencies for against that unity, the forms in which they will come up, and the current problem, the struggle that the UK has through Brexit. All of that is anticipated in those discussions. What are the issues which will cause that unity to fail, or what will make it succeed? And the issues which he describes there, describing literally the psychology of each of the countries and their historical circumstances and their temperament, and what needs to be done to bring them together. All these problems have been described there. It's amazing. Read those texts today, you say, oh my God, he's describing today, the world as it is today. So not only he foresaw, not only described the means by which we have to navigate, but he actually put in action the energies which would lead through these means. Except that there is a need for instruments, people who are conscious, people who can align themselves to this push of the divine will. Where there are not the necessary people, the will works to build the people. And eventually there will be the people. And eventually the work will be done through them. So it's just a question of timing and the means. Where people are unconscious and equally open to the positive and negative suggestions, well, the will uses them equally, even as they are misused by the other side, by the other forces. But eventually everything is compelled in the long run to what the divine has willed. So it is in this context I will again bring back to the comment I made about the mother placing the united map of India in the playground. These children who were growing up with this vision of the united map of India and the power that she infused in their bodies, in their minds, in their life force. She wanted that the work will be done, that they will become conscious instruments for this larger work of the divine in the whole world. And it's fascinating to see how all the children who grew up here are scattered across the whole world. In those days, where traveling across the world was so inconvenient, in the 50s and 60s, you find people settling across the world everywhere. And it's quite unusual. From a single town, which was B grade or C grade town, you find so many scattered across the world and so many coming from across the world. It's quite extraordinary. And through each of them, she has, to the extent that they were conscious and open, she has pushed forward her will to bring about some changes. And that's why the place in the playground, where the whole personality is being developed in alignment with that. And I can see from personal experience that because we grew up with that image, subconsciously, subliminally imprinted in us, every time when I travel out and I see a map of India, which is the divided, fragmented map, it looks like somebody whose arms are cut off. It looks incomplete. It's not true. I know it's a falsehood and I can see it. I don't even have to think about it. And where somewhere I see the complete map, it's obvious. This is it. This is true. This is real. This is conscious. Complete. And it acts at such a deep level that one does not even notice that it is there. But in all the thoughts, in all the actions, that vision of the truth has to be present. It forms and shapes everything. And so that's what she tried to imprint in these children. And I point to this because this is what we have to try to do in our life, consciously, not only in what we do, but among those that we influence. The children or the people who may come in our influence, with them, if we can create an environment which can similarly awaken in them that alignment, that they grow up in a mold in which there is a full continuity from the highest to the most physical of the divine force and its forms. 10 years ago we could have said such a unification, willing unification, would be impossible. 10 years ago. Today things have changed. But look back at Sri Aurobindo's message at the time of independence. I don't quote exactly, but something like this. He says, by whatever means the division has to go. And then he says, hopefully by a progressive the word he uses for coming together, for mutual understanding, or by force, or military force, by whatever way the division has to go. So there are two options, and the military option briefly was attempted. 72, Bangladesh became free. The other half failed. But by a progressive coming together of reconciliation of some kind, that is the natural way today. And if you look at the circumstances, India has become the focal point for the economic development of the region, even for large parts of the world. And so each of these countries which finds itself economically deficient and isolated would want to engage more deeply. As such, the coming together, Mother said, oh, by the way, she said this specifically. She said, when Pakistan breaks up and each part begins to want to rejoin with India, she said a kind of a federation will form where all these countries will come together. So this is the framework Sri Aurobindo had anticipated even when he discusses Europe and the unification of the world, a federal structure, where to the extent that a country needs, it keeps its identity, but otherwise comes into alignment in ways that effectively makes you one big family. That's all that matters. Political lines are irrelevant. What name you give is irrelevant. It is the alignment of the people that is important. That's the true unity. And so what name you give to it in the political structure does not matter. And in the last 2 years particularly, you will see rapid steps have been taken in this direction. First of all, in the last 20 years, the countries which form the united map of India are what have come together as SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. It started as a cultural framework, now has become an economic framework, and in the last 2 years there have been a series of agreements signed which involve developing internal trade routes, highways linking all these countries, and creating telecommunications infrastructure which is shared, including shared satellites, etc., everywhere that India has taken the lead. So you can see how it's a question of time before the political distinction will become irrelevant. And now it can be seen. You can actually say, yes, it's within our reach, and it can even happen within 5 or 10 years. It's that close. So progressive reconciliation, that means you come together progressively, you build up trust. You build up greater goodwill. You begin to help each other. And as that engagement begins, automatically other differences begin to fade out. Yes. So it's a very important question, yes.
The EU is going away.
Why in India this unity is so important? Does it have a spiritual foundation? Yes, it has. 2 things. First, that the space that was the complete India, and even under colonial rule, that space has been going back at least 5,000 years, and maybe more, has been culturally one unit. Spiritually, it has also been one unit. Politically, it was not. Politically, there were many kingdoms, but bound together by common culture and bound by common spiritual aspiration. And therefore, when India became politically free, ideally that would have been the occasion for the political unification, which would allow the spiritual and cultural unity now to take a distinct political form, and through that means play its role in the world. That politically it is divided is like the physical body being split while the subtle body is one. And the result is, in the physical body there is in fact increased friction and conflict, because you are 2 pieces which you cannot somehow force join. In fact, one of the pieces does not have a soul. It's like an arm cut off would not be a soul. And so Pakistan does not have an individuality of its own. Because its spiritual identity is one with the larger India, in order for it to retain its physical separateness, it has to manufacture a false identity. And so it manufactured itself as Pakistan, Paki meaning pure, the pure space. The rest is impure space. It became more extreme in its purity, an extremist Islamic form, calling itself pure, and it defined itself in terms of fear and hatred of India. Fear and hatred towards India. If you remove the fear and hatred towards India, the first question would be, well, why are we separate then? Because when you cross the border, it's the same people, the same culture, the same thinking, the same behavior, same language. So why are we separate? There's no reason for it, unless you bring in a false fear and hatred. And so the ego identity of the cut-off arm is exaggerated in a perverse form. Having no soul of its own, it becomes now open to Avataric Force, seizing now this ego identity. And what you see in fact is, in the last 20 years, Pakistan became the breeding ground for some of the most extreme terror training and ideologies. Saudi Arabia used Pakistan to develop what they wanted as the Islamic bomb, to develop the training grounds for the terrorists which later spread out everywhere, and so on. Now all of this was possible because the soul had been pushed back and the distorted form took place. All of it was anticipated by Sri Aurobindo in his note, saying, as long as this division persists, Sri Aurobindo writes in 1947, India's destiny may be seriously hampered and even negated, and war is possible. I'm paraphrasing, but this is broadly the words. He's anticipating all of these as long as the division exists. So the reunification of India, psychologically finally, but the reunification is essential for India to have a physical vehicle for the spiritual being which has formed and developed, for her to be able to play her spiritual role in the world. And that is first sign emerging again in the last 2 years with the conscious effort to promote yoga. And they have defined a yoga day where the Indian embassy organizes across the whole world in every country, thousands of people doing asanas and pranayam. But in a way that becomes the entry point for a spiritual ideal to connect to the whole world. And that to have taken that kind of initiative, to have taken initiatives to bring together all the weaker and smaller countries to help their development without personal interest. These are all things which have happened in the last few years, recently. And these are all signs of the spiritual personality of the nation coming forward. First signs, but still. And the way Sri Aurobindo formulated it, if India could not play her rightful role, then the spiritual awakening of the world itself would be compromised. Because there has to be one space where the spirituality can take on a large enough form, openly, and which can become the inspiration for the rest of the world to develop its own other variations. And Mother's creation of Auroville is the prototype of this, and as she mentions, it could only happen in India for the same reason. But her creating this in India is now setting a template, not just for India but for the whole world. And by doing this, she has hastened the whole process of this integration and the awakening and the spiritualization of the world. It's such an important step. And imagine at the age she was 91, 92. Imagine at that age for somebody to conceive of something which is impossible, to initiate it, to bring together the people and inspire them to start it, and then to promise that I will look after it through its development and continue to do it, even having left her body. It's such an extraordinary courage. It is only possible for somebody who is not bound to the biological limits and who can see across space and time and act across space and time. So they did on their part everything that was possible in spite of the human failings. Even today, we do not realize fully the role that Auroville plays in world affairs on an occult and spiritual level, and for India, of course. We do not see it fully. We're still too busy with our little small projects and little corners and little distinctions, and that's. But for her, through that, she is doing the larger work, irrespective of us. Of course, if we consciously interface, if we consciously make ourselves available, then the thing can happen so much faster. The spirit of what Auroville represents, we have each one to become within ourselves, in our interaction with the whole world. And then she acts through each of these points of light. We continue next Friday. Oh.